Hello, and welcome to the introduction to Power Talk. I'm Wayne Morgan, a member of the Ventura County League in California and a retired electrical engineer.
My name is Jackie Rivas. I'm a member of the Arlington and Alexandria League in Virginia, and I'm also on the Virginia League's Environmental Interest Group.
Hi, I'm Bill Kale, and I'm from the League of Women Voters of Central Kane County in Geneva, Illinois. And I am the climate specialist for the Issues and Advocacy Group for the League of Women Voters of Illinois. We are members of the Climate Action Plan team, or the CAP team, within the League of Women Voters U.S. Climate Interest Group called SIG. The League's document, Impact on Issues, enumerates the League's positions on many issues, and within the League's position on environmental protection and pollution control, the League supports environmentally sound use of energy resources with consideration of the entire cycle of the energy production, and predominantly relying on renewable resources, to name a few. Power Talk was written by the CAP team for League members to help us become more knowledgeable about sourcing electric power so that we can advocate for environmentally friendly and sound energy policy. Now I'll hand it off to Wayne.
Thank you, Bill. So now we'll give you a quick tour of Power Talk. Here are the sections of the document. I will be covering sections 1 through 4. Section 1 is the generation of electrical energy. Electric power is derived from other sources of energy, so electric power must be generated. Power Talk describes the characteristics and environmental impact of sources and generation methods listed here. I'm not going to discuss them all, as you're probably familiar with them, and you can always read about them in Power Talk. But I will say that I'm enthused about geothermal power. It can supply constant power and employs drilling technology, so some workers in the oil industry can transition to work on geothermal projects. And for some sites, like Salton Sea, California, the hot brine that is used contains lithium and other salts that can be extracted. In this section, you'll also find definitions of some commonly used units of measure: the volt, the ampere or amp, the watt, and the watt hour. Section 1.3 describes some terminology that's used in the industry. Distributed energy resources, known as DERs, are sources that are usually small-scale generation resources located near the end user. Centralized sources are usually large-scale facilities that need to use transmission lines to send power to end users. Firm energy is an energy source that is predictable and can be relied upon, such as hydro, fossil fuel plants, nuclear, and geothermal. Sources like wind and solar are intermittent sources. They can't be relied upon to supply a predictable amount of energy. Dispatchable refers to energy that can be supplied upon demand. Many firm energy sources are dispatchable. A gas-fired generator, known as a peaker plant, is called upon to supply energy during high demand and is a prime example of a dispatchable energy resource. Virtual power plants, or VPPs, are groups of distributed sources coordinated by software to act as a large, stable electrical source. Some VPPs include homeowners that have solar. Nameplate energy, or capacity, is the maximum amount of energy that the source can supply. Stranded assets refer to assets that are retired earlier than their original life expectancy. Legacy contracts refer to contracts for sources that are no longer desired but legally binding. Packetized energy is a relatively new concept to coordinate the supply and consumption of power. It does so by trading packets of energy between suppliers and consumers. So in the packetized energy model, a user may send a message to the controlling entity and request 5 kilowatt hours of energy in the next 15 minutes, or it may say that it has 5 kilowatt hours of energy that it can supply in the next 15 minutes. The controlling entity will then take this information and coordinate the transactions. So getting back to the League's position to have predominant reliance on renewable resources, where do we stand? Here is a graph of the amount of electric power that coal, gas, nuclear, and renewables generated over the last 72 years. In 2022, fossil fuels supplied about 60% of the U.S. electric power. So we have quite a ways to go. But the good news is that the cost of renewables, that is the levelized cost of electricity, is now competitive and even less than fossil fuel generators in many areas of the country. Now we come to Section 2, transmission of electrical energy. The electric grid is a network of power plants and transmission lines that distributes power to end users. Here's a picture of the grid. Power plants generate the electricity, which then gets converted to high voltage, then transmitted over transmission lines to local substations where the voltage is lowered for distribution to end users. The transmission lines are sometimes very long and operate at very high voltages, up to 1 million volts. The substations take the high voltage and convert it to lower voltage for local distribution. The local lines are typically 15,000 volts. Near the consumer, the voltage is dropped to 240 volts and 120 volts by transformers, which are typically mounted on utility poles. 2.3 describes future transmission needs. In a nutshell, the grid needs to be able to transmit more power, share power across the U.S., and be smarter. There are several technologies that can help, called grid enhancing technologies, that include sensors and software to squeeze more power carrying capacity out of the existing lines. As distributed resources are added to the grid, things get more complicated. In this diagram, the thick green lines show the flow of centralized power sources, but the thinner green lines can have power flowing in either direction, so this complicates the coordination of power flow across the grid. Section 2.4 describes microgrids. A microgrid is a small network of electricity users with a local means of generation. Microgrids are usually attached to the grid, but they are able to function independently. They typically have solar, batteries, and some form of backup like a gas-powered generator. A microgrid can power a single facility like a school or a hospital, or a larger area like a neighborhood, business district, or a town. And it's estimated that the energy generated by microgrids will grow by almost 300% by 2030. Section 3 describes some important terms to know that are related to distribution. Net energy metering, or NEM, and feed-in tariffs are both policies to encourage investment in renewable energy. NEM gives a credit for the amount of electricity sent back to the grid. This credit can then offset costs of electricity consumed. Feed-in tariffs are contracts to supply power at a fixed rate over a set period of time. Community solar is any solar project within an area whose energy benefits multiple consumers like individuals, businesses, and nonprofits. Section 4 describes storage technologies. Electricity needs to be used or stored as soon as it is generated. Intermittent sources like wind and solar require storage to optimize their utility. Even though storage adds cost to the system, Lazar's LCOE analysis shows that solar and wind combined with storage is cost competitive with other power sources, and these costs are still going down. Section 4.4 identifies different types of storage, such as pumped hydro, gravity storage, compressed air, flywheels, batteries, thermal storage, and hydrogen. I want to highlight some interesting things about thermal storage. It utilizes such things as molten metal, molten salts, or even cold, like liquid nitrogen. One talked about application is to convert a coal electric plant into a thermal storage facility where the excess power from the grid could heat the storage medium and then later drive generators with the stored heat. And since the grid is already connected to the plant, transmission lines shouldn't be a problem. There's lots of research money going into storage systems, so I expect to see many breakthroughs in the coming years that will significantly reduce the cost and increase the performance of these storage systems. You should be familiar with the famous duck curve shown here. The curves represent the power that is required from sources other than solar. In this graph, one day in spring in 2012 and 2020 are shown. You can see that in 2020, with more solar installed, the amount of power needed from other sources drops considerably. And in fact, California has had some time periods where the solar generation was greater than the demand and energy had to be sent out of state or not used, or curtailed, as it is called. Smoothing out this duck curve with storage will allow better utilization of energy. Section 4.8 discusses demand response. This is a method to smooth consumption of power by controlling heavy loads like water heating, air conditioning, and pumps. By smoothing out the load, the peak power requirements of the supply are reduced and can thus reduce costs for the consumer and the utility. Time of use, or TOU, is an important component of this demand management. Time of use rates are rates that are determined by the demand in certain time periods throughout the day and are being adopted in many places. So it's important to be for consumers to be aware of TOU rates, as some of these rates can be very high. Many utilities offer programs that notify users to reduce consumption when demand is high, and some of these utilities even pay for not using power during these critical times. And now I will turn it over to Jackie, who will continue with Section 5.
Thank you, Wayne. I'm going to give a brief overview of the different entities involved in producing and delivering electricity across the United States. Then I'll review the various entities that regulate electricity providers at the federal, state, and local levels. We all depend on electricity and expect it to be there when we need it. But behind the scenes, the electric system is a complicated network of thousands of entities involved in bringing electricity to your door. There are also many different players involved in regulating the system, setting prices, and ensuring that the system is safe and reliable. There are thousands of utility companies that play a part in generating electricity for our homes and offices. Most electricity is produced by investor-owned utilities and independent power producers. To a lesser degree, electricity is also generated by municipal-owned utilities and federal power agencies. Electricity is moved long distances from the power plant, such as a nuclear plant or a solar farm, along high-voltage transmission lines to local distribution lines. Investor-owned utilities handle most of the transmission and about half of the distribution, with municipal utilities providing the other half of distribution. There are about 192 for-profit investor-owned utilities. They are few in number, but large in size, with billions of dollars in assets, and frequently operate in multiple states. About 75% of U.S. utility customers get their electricity from an investor-owned utility. They are legal monopolies. The rates are set by state public utility commissions, with rates generally reflecting the cost to build, finance, maintain, and operate power plants and the grid. The incentive is for the utility to build more infrastructure to pass along the cost to ratepayers. Efficiency is not a factor in setting rates. There are about 2,900 municipal utilities. They are not-for-profit entities governed by a city council or an elected or appointed board. They serve about 14% of electricity customers in the U.S. There are also 9 federal power market agencies, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority and the 4 Department of Energy power marketing administrations. Some states also have power marketing agencies. Electric cooperatives are private, not-for-profit utilities owned by their customers and operated as a business. The Rural Electrification Act of 1936 provided federal loans to electrify rural areas as part of FDR's New Deal. Rural areas were not considered profitable by investor-owned utilities and thus not served. There are more than 900 member-owned electric cooperatives, mostly in the Midwest and Southeast. In the 1990s, the federal government deregulated the generation and transmission of electric energy in order to promote competition in these markets. There are 18 states that have fully or partially deregulated their electric markets. Deregulation led to new players in the system, but it hasn't necessarily brought down prices. Customers that choose to leave a utility company as their power provider may have to pay an exit fee. Some of the new players brought about by deregulation include community choice aggregators, independent power producers, and electric power marketers. Community choice aggregators are local, not-for-profit entities that select the sources of energy, but the investor-owned utilities still provide transmission and distribution capabilities. Communities can access greener sources of generation or perhaps lower rates. 10 states have enacted community choice aggregation legislation. An example of a community that wanted greener energy but was unable to get it from their investor-owned utility is Ann Arbor, Michigan. The city created a sustainable energy utility. Michigan is a partially deregulated state and has a 100% clean electricity target for 2040. Ann Arbor created a publicly owned, locally powered utility. It provides energy from local solar and battery storage systems and networked geothermal systems. It offers energy waste reduction programs, appliance replacement initiatives, along with clean, local, and reliable energy. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, is an independent agency created in 1977 after the 1973 oil crisis. The Federal Power Act mandates that wholesale rates are just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory or preferential. There are 5 commissioners with staggered 5-year terms. FERC regulates rates and services for interstate electric transmission and electric wholesale power sales and prohibits energy market manipulation. FERC's Office of Public Participation assists the public with commission proceedings. Other regulatory organizations include NERC, the RTOs, and NARUC. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, is a not-for-profit international regulatory authority that ensures the reliability and security of the grid, including the impacts of climate change. The regional transmission organizations, RTOs, ensure the reliability and non-discriminatory access to the grid. The National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC, is focused on improving the quality and effectiveness of public utility regulation. This is a map of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation's 6 regions. The WECC is the Western Interconnect. ERCOT is in Texas, and the rest are in the Eastern Interconnect. This is a map of the regional transmission organizations, or RTOs. The RTOs coordinate the power flow within the interconnections. There are 2 large interconnected grids, the Eastern and the Western interconnects, and then Texas. There are 36 RTOs in the Eastern interconnection and 37 RTOs in the Western interconnection. So you can see that lots of coordination is required between these RTOs, and they must comply with standards set by NERC. 2 more important federal institutions are the Department of Energy and the EPA. The Department of Energy coordinates energy policy and develops a strategic plan. It has multiple program offices and supervises 17 national laboratories that research and develop clean energy technologies, including battery storage, renewable power, electric vehicles, carbon capture, and resilient grid infrastructure. The EPA provides renewable energy information and resources to state, local, and tribal governments. And now I will pass it along to Bill.
All right, well, thank you, Jackie. I'm going to review the final portion of the Power Talk document. Here I want to focus on 3 parts. First, renewable energy credits and carbon offsets. These are financial instruments that encourage emissions reductions. Renewable energy credits, or RECs, are payments for creating renewable energy, and carbon offsets are payments for reducing carbon emissions. These are 2 variations on a theme that theme being how to reduce carbon emissions. RECs are a way to minimize the impact of creating electricity by creating more renewable energy, while carbon offsets minimize the impact from industrial and agricultural processes, of which there are many. You could say carbon offsets are for all the other ways to reduce emissions, other than using renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. But both of these are available now and do not require any new technology, but both require some scrutiny to maintain their effectiveness. While RECs can be tied to a specific source of creation, carbon offsets are more nebulous. They are basically a second best choice in most situations. Unfortunately, in some, they are currently the only choice, but they have a tarnished record. They are subject to fraud and often are seen as a dodge from taking more substantial efforts. When used, these should be examined and monitored carefully. For instance, my town has a 50-year contract with a coal plant, and we could not end that anytime soon. In the interim, we could buy RECs or carbon offsets. In fact, they spent $140,000 on a consultant to create a plan to build renewable energy with batteries on city property and to buy carbon offsets to counter the actual coal plant. Although there is some enthusiasm for this project, it still remains a work in process. Some of our neighbor communities were being asked to renew their 25-year coal contracts for another 20 years, and working with local advocacy groups, we were able to stop that and redirect these city councils to pursue a long-term energy plan instead. The second part I want to review is Section 6 on the planning and transition, especially Section 6.5 titled Local Governments and Energy Democracy. This is where you come in. This is key for your local league. When you go to the League of Women Voters US website, the very first line of copy says, empowering voters, defending democracy. Come back to that in a minute, but I want to note that usually smaller towns and co-ops will create or join a larger group for several reasons. Technical expertise, legal protection, buying power, all good things. These larger groups are called joint action agencies or generation and transmission co-ops, called the G&Ts. If you are in a municipal or a cooperative utility and they say your local utility is governed by the city or town councils, they frequently mean that this is who sends a representative to the joint action agency or the G&T. And those organizations are run by select executive committees that do all the work. I'm not saying they're prone to corruption or incompetence. I am not saying they practice bad management. I'm just saying they're used to doing things a certain way, a way that does not include public participation. They may use an expansive interpretation of the Open Meetings Act that leads to many key decisions being made behind closed doors during executive sessions that are not public. Unless they happen to be a very progressive group, you may find that your community is more interested in renewable energy than they are. This may make democracy very difficult. Going back to the League statement, empowering voters, defending democracy, I want to compare this statement with what's on the website of the American Public Power Association. They say they represent 2,000 communities and 55 million people. This is what they say public power is, and I'm going to quote them here. It's only 3 or 4 lines. Like public schools and libraries, public power utilities are owned by the community and run as a division of local government. These utilities are governed by a local city council or an elected or appointed board. Community citizens have a direct voice in utility decisions, including the rate it charges and the source of electricity. Line 2 of the above quote says, your local utility is run by an appointed board. Line 3 says, community citizens have a direct voice in utility decisions, including rates and power source. Once again, unless you have a very active citizens group or a very progressive board of directors, that choice of power source will default to the appointed board, defaults to the executive committee. It's efficient, but not transparent, and it's not amenable to changes. So here's the chain of command for your local utility if it participates in a JAA, a joint action agency, or a G&T. City councils appoint a representative, likely the head of the electrical department, but it could be any city official. They make up the agency board of directors, who turn over most of the work to the executive committee. So if you go to talk to your village or city council about how they plan for future electric power, they might not have a robust grasp on that concept because they probably have never had to do that before. This is where there's a lot of room for public education, both for councils and residents. This is a perfect initiative for local leagues. I'll just conclude by saying that if you're not part of a very large corporate-owned private utility like most, you are likely one of those 2,000 communities that are a public utility, and as such, quote, community citizens have a direct voice in utility decisions, unquote. But more likely than not, they are not going to give it to you. You will have to ask for it. You will have to put the public into your public utility. Once again, section 6.5 is key. Now, part 3 of my review, I just wanted to mention briefly the recommended resources at the back of the document. They're at the end, and it looks like something you would go through after you've read the whole document. And if you have more questions, then you might search out this extra information. But that's not all it is. This is much more like a parallel universe. We could have called it alternative resources. And I'd like to encourage you to check these out, even if you don't read much of the larger document, especially the podcasts and newsletters that are an easy entry into the continuing climate story.
This concludes our presentation on Power Talk. We hope it will motivate you to learn more and to participate in advocating for renewable electric power in your area.